Go.
Okay, this is some stories about Maddie's ancestors. Maddie Effler is my granddaughter, and I'm going to tell you some history about my family. My grandfather, which would be Maddie's great-great-grandfather, was born in Cage Cove in the Great Smoky Mountains in 1880. His father had previously been in the Civil War. He lived in Blount County at the time, up around Wallen, and he walked all the way to Kentucky to join the Union Army. Most of East Tennessee at the time was pro-Union. They fought for the North. But anyway, after he got out of the Civil War, he lived in Wallen, and he moved in the late 1870s, he moved into Cage Cove, where my grandfather was born. My grandfather was born there in 1880 in one of the cabins that's still over in Cage Cove, where they was living at the time. It was the Tipton Oliver cabin. His daddy was renting that place at the time. And his daddy was he was a cook in the Civil War, and he was a blacksmith by trade, so they used him in that way. And he passed all this on to my grandfather. When he was living in Cage Cove, he was a coffin maker. My grandfather's father was a coffin maker, and he provided that service for the community. He passed that trade on to my grandfather. Blacksmith work and carpentry work. And my grandfather, he was married around the turn of the century, around 1900, 1901, somewhere around in there. And he started a family, which my father was one of his children. And they lived in a mountain area, not in the cove part, down in there where all the big fields are at. They lived back on a mountain farm back in there and had about 75 acres. It was partially cleared so they could farm. And he took up the job as coffin maker in Cage Cove. And he made coffins for families. The way they would handle things, when they cut lumber, they would put some of the good lumber up in somebody's barn and keep it till somebody was in need of a coffin. My grandfather would collect that wood, and he would go and prepare the body for burial and make a coffin. They'd do most everything just in a couple of days and go ahead and get the body buried, because they didn't have modern techniques of embalming bodies and things. But he would handle that part of things, but he was also very skilled in blacksmith work and things like that. Most everybody back then had to be pretty self-sufficient, but they had to be able to do a lot of things on their own. So my grandfather, he was a hunter. He loved to hunt and provide for his family and things of that nature. And he would guide different people to come in to the mountains and hunt and take them on hunting trips. And he provided services that way. And he worked he even came out of the mountains in the early part of the 1900s and worked for the Aluminum Company of Alcoa for a few weeks at a time to make extra money. But my father was born, which would be Maddie's great-grandfather. He was born in 1913, and they lived in a little log cabin. And my grandfather was in the process of building them a house, and he finally got it finished around 1921, and they moved into the house that was made out of sawmill lumber and boards, which was a big step above what they were living in. And he would, they farmed and provided all their own food. they would gather things like, my grandfather had a lot of bees there at one time, and they would gather up big cans of honey, and back when there was chestnuts in the mountain before the blight hit all the American chestnut trees and killed them, they'd gather up lots of them, and they would take apples and things, and they would drive out with horse and wagons and come to Maryville and sell their goods. But the parks, they started developing the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, and it took in Cage Cove, and the families had to move out and sell their properties to the government, and took their homes away from them. My grandfather stayed on a little longer and worked for some of the government workers that came in. It was working on the roads and bridges and things for the park, and he was a foreman with them. They finally moved out in about 1936 and moved out into on the outskirts of Maryville here, out in the county, and had a farm. And my grandfather, he loved carving and things like that. He was always carving animals and things that they had around, around where he was raised, and he was pretty skilled at that. He could make chairs and different things. He could build chairs, and he could do all sorts of blacksmith work and just a lot of things that, they had to have. But this is just a little example. This is one of the things that I have left that he carved out. It's a little squirrel, and he's got his name marked on it, and he's got December the 25th, 1960. And he died in 1961. And his wife lived on for about another 5 years. When 1961, I was about 9 years old, but I remember going to his house and staying all night with him and Grandma when I was a small child. But that's just a little bit of the history of our family. So that's about all I can think of, unless you have any more questions.
Okay.
Now, in my grandpa's later years, after they moved out of Cage Cove, there was a gentleman that used to write an article on in the Knoxville Journal around 1960, and he came out and interviewed my grandpa, and he recorded it. And I've got several cousins and people in my family that love keeping up with studying their genealogy and keeping records and things like that. And there's a lot of newspaper clippings out of that Knoxville Journal that they've kept down through the years. And also, we have a tape of about an hour long with this interview that Vic Wills worked for the Journal. He came out and interviewed my grandpa, and we can sit down and listen to my grandpa relating to him what life was like when they lived in Cage Cove and things of that nature. But he loved interviewing my grandpa. My grandpa had a lot of interesting tales to tell him, and he would ask questions like what they had to eat, what their activities was. I remember in that tape he was talking about what they had to eat, and my grandpa was telling him that they had all kinds of vegetation and different things like that, and some of the activities that they had. Grandpa was talking about going to corn shuckings and apple peelings when they'd all get together and putting up their crops and helping each other. Neighbors relied on each other a lot back in those times. They had to be able to survive. But one particular story comes to mind that one of my uncles was telling. My grandfather had a good friend, and they done a lot together, and they was in the mountains hunting together, and they might go out and stay, 2 or 3 days or a week in the mountains hunting, and they'd just lay down wherever they was at and go to sleep at night. Sometimes they'd throw them up a little shelter, out of sticks with like a little lean-to that they would get under. And they had them a fire built up and eat supper, and they laid down that night to sleep, and it was early in the fall. And back in the mountains there was rattlesnakes and copperheads, which was poison snakes. But it wasn't cold enough to put them into hibernation during the day. And they had laid down that night and went to sleep. And the next morning his friend woke up, and my grandpa was laying over there, and early in the morning he got up to put some more wood on the fire and keep it going. And he happened to look over at my grandpa laying there, and my grandpa had a pair of overalls on. And he seen a snake's tail sticking out of my grandpa's pants leg. And he seen that it was a rattlesnake, and that rattlesnake had crawled in there when it got to getting cool that night next to my grandpa where that body heat was at. And he crawled up his pants leg, and his friend woke him up and told him that that there was a rattlesnake up his pants leg to not move. And they was trying to figure out how to get him out of that predicament he was in. So his friend told him, he said, I'm going to try to find where its head's at up here under your pants leg, and I'm going to grab it through your pants and grab a hold of its head so you can get rid of this thing. So his friend, he calculated about where that snake's head was at up in his pants leg, and he grabbed a hold of it and was holding it. And my grandpa, he undone his overalls and he slid out of them until he could get out of that. So I do know my grandpa got bit one time by a copperhead on his hand, and he didn't do nothing about it other than go to there wasn't any doctors around, but he where that snake bit him, well, he grabbed a hold of it real quick and mashed it up and squeezed some of the poison back out, and then he wrapped a rag soaked in coal oil that they used in their lanterns. They used that a lot for medicine. He wrapped that around it, and he said it never did swell up very big, but he never did go to the doctor with it. But people just had to make do back then. I know one time after they moved out of the mountains and lived here near Maryville, he was working over at the barn, him and his son, and they was putting hay up in the barn. At the time, they used to put hay up just loose. It wasn't in a bale or anything like that. And they'd haul it in on a wagon with the horses. And they had a big fork that come out of the top of the barn, a big fork. They'd drop it down into the wagon load of hay and get a big load of that hay, and they'd pull it up with pulleys and a rope. They had a horse on the other end of the rope on the other side of the barn, and they'd pull it up, and it would take it back into the barn, and they could release it and let it fall. Well, my grandpa was loading on the wagon, and his son was at the other end of the barn with the horse to pull it up, and his son thought he heard him yell to go ahead, so he started pulling it. Well, my grandfather got his hands caught in that metal rake, and it pulled him up off the ground, off of the wagon, and finally he got his son, got him stopped. Well, it had tore all of the back of his hand. It had tore it off, and all these bones in the back of his hand was broke and sticking out. So he went to the house, and he took his pocket knife, and he cleaned the ends of them bones good and pushed them back down in there. And he had my grandma to sew his hand up with a needle and thread and sew all that meat back on. And later that evening or that night, it got to hurting him so bad that he was just in so much pain he was really out of his head. And they took him on to Maryville to a doctor, and the doctor told him all he could do was give him a shot of, give him something for pain and give him a tetanus shot of some type. And he said he's already got it fixed up. He said, I can't do nothing for him. So they sent him back home then, and all of that healed, and he got well. But that's how tough people was back then. They had to rely on themselves a lot. But I thought that was a pretty interesting story.